Something just broke. Not a tweet, not a press briefing, not a fleeting argument between aides. Something far deeper. The kind of fracture that doesn't make noise immediately, but that future historians will mark as the moment the United States' approach to its closest neighbor fundamentally shifted. I'm talking about Canada. 75 years of careful integration, shared borders, intertwined energy grids, and an economy so interlocked with the United States that it practically breathed with it. And yet, in real time, that relationship is being tested like never before. The mainstream media will tell you this is about personalities. Two men in power who didn't see eye to eye. They are wrong. This is about power, about empire, about a president willing to weaponize the economic might of the United States to bend a sovereign G7 nation to his will. This is Trump's North America on display, brash, unfiltered, uncompromising. On February 1, 2025, the White House announced something that sent shockwaves through Ottawa and Washington alike. Executive orders signed by President Donald Trump imposed tariffs that were anything but symbolic: 25% on most Canadian goods, 10% on energy exports. Think about that. 3/4 of Canada's merchandise exports heading south overnight, facing a wall of American economic force. As the Wall Street Journal itself would later call it, in disbelief, this was the dumbest trade war in history. But here's the twist nobody is emphasizing: these tariffs were never about trade deficits or protecting steel and aluminum jobs in the Midwest. They were a tool of coercion. A blunt instrument wielded to pressure Canada toward a vision Trump openly articulated: the annexation of Canada, making it the 51st state. He called the border artificial. He said Canada survives because the United States allows it. And he believed that economic force could bring about compliance. This is the moment where theater meets reality. The Trump administration saw policy as leverage. The tariffs, the tweets, the threats, they were all chess pieces in a game where the objective wasn't negotiation but submission. And Canada? Canada wasn't about to play the part of the vassal quietly. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you how this wasn't just a trade dispute. How Trump's gambit, designed to assert dominance, may have unintentionally pushed Canada toward strategic independence on a scale no American president had anticipated. How jobs in Oshawa, factories in Detroit, and even your grocery bills are connected to a single, audacious vision of American control. And how, behind the scenes, one man, Mark Carney, quietly orchestrated a response that could redefine North America for decades. This is the story the mainstream press will call a spat between leaders. I'm calling it the beginning of a structural transformation. The kind of story that won't be fully understood until years from now. And if you're here, watching, you're seeing it unfold live. To understand why February 2025 was more than just another headline, we need to go back 70 years. Not to the politics of the day, not to election cycles, but to the architecture of a relationship so carefully managed that it almost seemed permanent: the United States and Canada. For decades, the two nations performed a political theater of partnership. State dinners, joint statements, friendship of equals rhetoric, but the truth was more subtle and far more revealing. Canada supplied the raw materials, the oil, the gas, the uranium, the potash, the minerals that fueled American industry. The United States supplied the market, the financial infrastructure, the consumption that made the Canadian economy hum. On paper, it looked like a partnership. In reality, it was a classic corporate arrangement, polite, managed quietly, and always calibrated for the benefit of American capital. From the long, undefended border, 12,875 kilometers that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, to integrated supply chains in autos, energy, and manufacturing, the economic systems of both nations were tightly interlocked. Detroit and Windsor weren't just neighboring cities, they were nodes in a single industrial ecosystem. Steel, aluminum, automotive parts, electricity, pipelines, all flowed with clockwork precision. Nearly $2 trillion in goods and services crossed that border every year. The press releases celebrated it. The state dinners honored it. But underneath the pomp, the balance of power had always leaned heavily toward the United States. This wasn't conspiracy. It wasn't sinister. It was strategic. Any economist looking at the flows of capital, the direction of trade, the ownership of key resources would see the pattern: the United States consumed, Canada produced. The design was mutually beneficial but asymmetrical. The difference? Americans reaped the margins. Canadians got stability. And for decades the system functioned flawlessly. And then Trump entered the stage. For much of the post-war era, US-Canada relations had been defined by predictability. Policies changed but slowly. Leadership transitioned, governments evolved, crises emerged, but the architecture remained intact. Canadian prime ministers and central bankers knew the rules of engagement. They knew when to negotiate, when to acquiesce, and when to push back subtly. The United States knew it could apply pressure, but also that Canada's compliance was reliable. It was a partnership, yes, but one managed with the confidence of an empire that never feared refusal. Trump's approach shattered that expectation. Where previous administrations had worked through negotiation, diplomacy, and incremental trade adjustments, he chose direct confrontation. He weaponized tariffs not to protect a specific industry, but to force compliance with a vision few others had even entertained, bringing Canada to heel under the United States' control. His vision wasn't hidden in the footnotes of a policy brief, it was spelled out in speeches, tweets, and executive orders. And this was precisely why the historical context mattered. The system had never been tested this way before. The polite, predictable framework of integration, the long-standing interdependence, was suddenly under stress. For Canadian strategists, the writing was clear: the era of predictable deference was over. This wasn't just another policy dispute. This was a test of sovereignty, of national resilience, of economic strategy. And while the U.S. had always been the dominant partner, Trump's unpredictability exposed the limits of American leverage. For decades, the implicit understanding had been, integration equals cooperation. Now, integration had become a vulnerability, a lever that could be pulled, but with unknown consequences. Here's where the twist begins: the Canadian response was never just reactive. This isn't a story of a smaller nation bowing to coercion. For decades, Canadian leaders had quietly diversified trade, built reserves, and developed infrastructure capable of withstanding shocks. Trump didn't know this. He assumed the old rules still applied. That assumption would prove to be the first miscalculation of a strategy designed to dominate. Understanding this historical foundation is crucial. The tariffs didn't occur in a vacuum. They struck a system that had been designed for stability, efficiency, and mutual benefit, but always with asymmetry favoring the United States. And the shock wasn't merely economic. It was cultural, psychological. The unspoken hierarchy that had defined North American integration for 75 years suddenly faced direct confrontation. In short, the United States, under Trump, attempted to bend a long-standing relationship to an extreme vision of control. And Canada, far from being a passive actor, was positioned to respond with both precision and patience. This was not about personalities, it was about a centuries-old architecture of power and dependency meeting the audacity of a president who believed tariffs alone could rewrite history. February 1, 2025. A date that would be remembered not in press releases or polite diplomatic statements, but in the trembling balance sheets of Canadian exporters and in the tense conference rooms of American industry. That morning, President Donald Trump signed executive orders that imposed a 25% tariff on most Canadian imports and a 10% tariff on energy products. Not small, not symbolic, but a blunt economic hammer aimed squarely at a nation that had for decades been America's closest partner. Let's pause and understand what that really means. Canada sends roughly 75% of its merchandise exports to the United States. Overnight, three-quarters of a $700 billion trade relationship faced a wall of tariffs that were neither negotiated nor anticipated. The Wall Street Journal called it, without hyperbole, the dumbest trade war in history. This wasn't partisan exaggeration. It was the financial establishment recoiling at a move that defied logic, economics, and decades of careful integration. But here's the twist that most reporting missed: these tariffs were never about protecting steel, or aluminum jobs in Ohio. They weren't about trade deficits or domestic industry alone. They were a tool of coercion, a weapon wielded to enforce a vision Trump had openly articulated: the annexation of Canada as the 51st state. He didn't mask the intent. He called the border artificial, claimed Canada survives because of the United States, and implied that economic force could compel compliance. Canada reacted immediately. Ottawa slapped retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion of U.S. goods, escalating to $155 billion as the months progressed. Provinces joined the fray. Ontario's LCBO removed American alcohol from its shelves, Nova Scotia doubled commercial tolls, and even the Starlink contract with Elon Musk was cancelled. These weren't mere gestures. They were statements. Canada wasn't just defending revenue, it was signaling autonomy, defiance, and strategic awareness. The human cost was immediate. Canadian exports to the U.S. fell 26% in just 4 months. Jobs in export-reliant sectors began disappearing. The auto industry in southern Ontario, integrated with Detroit for decades, was first in the firing line. General Motors laid off 500 workers at its Oshawa plant in January 2026. That's 500 families facing uncertainty, rent, and bills, all because of a policy decision in Washington. And the economic ripple wasn't contained to Canada. Detroit, Michigan, Ohio, industries tied to integrated supply chains felt the tremors. Dairy farmers lost a market, steel producers lost suppliers, and American consumers began paying more at the checkout. Trump's strategy, designed to pressure Canada, was creating a mirror pain on U.S. soil. But this is where the narrative gets more complex and more viral. The tariffs were designed to intimidate, to assert dominance, to bring Canada to its knees. Instead, they catalyzed strategic independence. Canadian provincial governments, corporate leaders, and central bankers began coordinating responses that were patient, deliberate, and forward-looking. Every measure Trump imposed was being transformed into an opportunity for Canada to reduce dependency, diversify trade, and assert sovereignty in a way that hadn't been necessary for decades. Here's the critical point: the story isn't just numbers. It's about the audacity of one president thinking tariffs could bend an entire country to his will. It's about the miscalculation of American leverage. It's about the emergence of a Canada that recognized its strategic power, and the man at the center of that realization, Mark Carney, preparing to play a game of chess on a board Trump believed he dominated. This isn't theory. This is history being written in real time. And for every viewer watching from Windsor, Detroit, or Ottawa, the stakes are immediate. Jobs, exports, energy supply, and economic stability are all on the line. Trump expected fear. He expected compliance. He expected Canada to fold under the weight of his tariffs. He was wrong. Within weeks of February 2025, Canadian provinces began responding, not quietly, not politely, but with precision and visibility. Ontario's LCBO, the government-run liquor authority, pulled all American alcohol from its shelves. Nova Scotia doubled tolls on commercial vehicles crossing the border. Even the private sector got involved. Starlink, Elon Musk's company, had its Canadian contract cancelled. Each action carried a message: Canada understood the game Trump was playing, and it would not play along. This wasn't just bureaucratic posturing. It was the first real signal that the relationship had shifted from polite integration to contested autonomy. These moves were carefully calculated. The LCBO's removal of American products hit consumer markets directly. Nova Scotia's toll increase targeted the movement of goods across critical trade routes. Every action, visible to Americans and Canadians alike, was a demonstration of material power. Canada could retaliate, and when it did, it would be felt economically and politically. And the consequences were immediate. Canadian exports to the U.S., already under stress from the new tariffs, fell dramatically. Jobs in manufacturing and resource sectors began disappearing. But beyond the numbers, the provinces were signaling something far more significant: a willingness to assert sovereignty and resist coercion. Here's the twist: these were not national-level partisan moves. They weren't orchestrated for headlines. They were calculated, localized, and strategic, designed to push back against Trump without collapsing Canada's economy. While Trump's tweets and executive orders grabbed attention, these provincial measures quietly reshaped the battlefield. Think about it, the Ambassador Bridge, connecting Windsor and Detroit, handles more than 25% of all US-Canada trade. Disruptions here don't just inconvenience logistics, they affect American businesses, workers, and consumers. The integrated supply chain that Trump assumed he controlled became a conduit for mutual vulnerability. Every tariff he imposed bounced back, creating friction in U.S. industries that relied on Canadian inputs. And while American media focused on the drama, on the personalities, on Trump's tweets, the provinces acted strategically. This wasn't chaos. It was calculated resistance, a lesson in leverage that few in Washington fully understood. These symbolic measures, combined with economic retaliation, were quietly setting the stage for a Canada that would not simply return to the old rules once the tariffs were lifted. The larger story here is structural. It's about power, about leverage, about the limits of coercion when one partner is integrated yet independent enough to fight back. And it's a warning to anyone watching: Trump's assumptions about compliance, about obedience, about the ability to bend Canada to his will were flawed. The game had changed and Canada was leading the play. Trump thought tariffs were just numbers on paper. He thought a 25% levy on Canadian goods would be a lever, simple, clean, effective. He underestimated the consequences. From January to April 2025, Canadian exports to the U.S. dropped by 26% in just 4 months. That's not abstract economics. That's tens of thousands of shipments halted, factories idling, and families facing uncertainty. In southern Ontario, the heart of the integrated auto industry, General Motors laid off 500 workers at its Oshawa plant. Each number here is a story: a parent scrambling to pay rent, a child adjusting to a sudden reality, a community shaken at its core. It didn't stop at Canada's borders. The economic ripples reached Detroit, Michigan, and beyond. The Ambassador Bridge, one of the busiest trade crossings in the world, handles over 25% of US-Canada trade. When supply chains falter, both sides bleed. US steel companies lost Canadian clients. Dairy farmers lost their market. American consumers began paying more at the grocery store. Trump's attempt to pressure Canada was, paradoxically, creating collateral damage at home. Interest rates tell the story as clearly as factory floors. The Bank of Canada, responding to pervasive uncertainty caused by fluctuating tariffs, cut rates twice in early 2025. Business investment stalled. Employment in export-dependent sectors plunged. Investors, supply chain managers, and CEOs were forced to reconsider assumptions that had held true for decades, that the U.S. would always be a predictable partner. But here's the deeper twist, the element that most mainstream analyses ignore. Trump's tariffs were intended to bend Canada to his will. Instead, they accelerated a strategic shift. Canada didn't just endure, they began to reduce their dependency on the U.S. market. Provinces and businesses began actively seeking alternative partners: Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Exports to the EU rose 22%, to Africa 18%, and to Central and South America 11%. The UK replaced China as Canada's second-largest trading partner. Uranium, petroleum, pharmaceuticals, Canada diversified with precision. At the same time, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, was orchestrating this diversification quietly and deliberately. Trump was creating chaos, Carney was creating options. While Americans were fixated on headlines, Carney was building a network of trade and finance that would reduce Canada's reliance on a single, unpredictable neighbor. This wasn't reactionary, it was proactive, strategic, and long-term. The human cost remains stark. In manufacturing corridors, layoffs, short-term unemployment, and disrupted supply chains dominated headlines. But the structural story is just as important. These tariffs, meant to intimidate, forced Canada to rethink its economic architecture. What Trump assumed would weaken Canada actually forged a country more resilient, more diversified, and less vulnerable to coercion than it had been in decades. Consider the auto worker in Oshawa again. Today, they are paying the price for a policy they did not design. But the factories and supply chains they relied on are slowly realigning, not back to Washington's timetable, but to Canada's strategic vision. The disruption is painful, but permanent recalibration is underway. This is the paradox of Trump's strategy. In trying to dominate, he revealed the fragility of American assumptions about North America. In trying to assert unilateral control, he catalyzed Canadian resilience. In trying to intimidate, he taught the world a lesson: integration cannot always be weaponized without consequences. Trump believed he was in full control. That tariffs, tweets, and executive orders could bend a nation to his will. He assumed integration meant compliance. But he had underestimated one man, and through him, an entire system quietly coming into motion: Mark Carney. Carney is not a hero. He is not a revolutionary. He is a technocrat of the highest order, a man who spent his career managing systemic risk at the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, and in global finance. Goldman Sachs, the IMF, and the world's largest bond markets recognize him not for spectacle, but for precision, discipline, and an unerring understanding of capital flows. He reads balance sheets the way most people read the morning news. And in May 2025, when he first met Trump in the Oval Office, he did something the president likely did not expect: he refused to play theater. "Canada is not for sale," Carney said. Plain, calm, measured. No insults. No dramatic gestures. Just a statement of fact. Trump tried to assert dominance. Carney simply treated the president not as an emperor, but as a systemic risk that needed containment. And this is where the strategy becomes fascinating. While Trump focused on tariffs, threats, and public pressure, Carney was quietly constructing alternatives. He visited China, the European Union, and other global partners. He signed agreements, initiated trade discussions, and built a network designed to reduce Canada's dependency on a single, increasingly erratic neighbor. He didn't threaten the U.S. He simply showed the world and Trump that Canada had options. Here's the twist that most analysts missed: Carney was not merely reacting. He was proactive. Every move was calculated not for immediate headlines, but for the next 50 years of Canadian strategy. He understood something fundamental: when one partner acts unpredictably, the other must diversify, stabilize, and assert sovereignty without collapsing its own economy. This was chess. And Trump, with all his audacity, was playing checkers. By late 2025, the effects of this strategy were becoming measurable. Canadian exports to Europe surged 22%, to Africa 18%, to Central and South America 11%. The UK replaced China as Canada's second-largest trading partner. Gold exports to London jumped nearly 500% in a single month. Electric vehicle supply chains were being redirected toward Beijing. The diversification wasn't just economic, it was geopolitical. Canada was sending a message: the United States could not unilaterally control outcomes in North America. Trump's administration misread the signals. Where they saw disruption, Carney saw leverage. Where they assumed panic, he saw strategic opportunity. And as the U.S. doubled tariffs in mid-2025, Carney's moves accelerated, further insulating Canada's economy and signaling to investors that Ottawa had a long-term plan. This wasn't reactionary, it was calculated, precise, and almost surgical in its execution. Meanwhile, Canadian provincial leaders aligned with Carney's vision. They supported short-term economic measures, the LCBO's removal of U.S. products, toll increases, and targeted industry interventions, while simultaneously supporting a larger, national strategy of diversification. Two tracks emerged: immediate resilience to Trump's economic pressure, and long-term autonomy from U.S. dominance. Here's the viral point: the very policies Trump assumed would break Canada's will instead reinforced its independence. What he intended as coercion became a catalyst for strategic sophistication. Carney didn't just defend Canadian sovereignty. He enhanced it, creating a blueprint for a nation to survive and thrive despite a president who saw power as unilateral, immediate, and personal. And the implications extend beyond North America. Every U.S. investor, pension fund, and multinational operating in the region is forced to reassess assumptions. Supply chains that relied on integrated North American logistics are being rerouted. Energy flows, previously dependent on cross-border pipelines and grids, are being diversified globally. Trump's audacity inadvertently accelerated a permanent reconfiguration of trade and geopolitical relationships in the Western Hemisphere. The President of the United States, commanding the world's largest economy, attempted to leverage integration as a weapon. And a single technocrat, operating with discipline, foresight, and patience, turned that weapon into an opportunity for his country and the world to rethink its dependencies. Trump believed his tariffs would bend Canada. He believed his audacity would force compliance. But as the months rolled on, a different story emerged, one that few in Washington wanted to admit. What was intended as coercion became the catalyst for transformation. By 2026, it was clear, Canada was no longer the dependent neighbor the United States had assumed it to be. The diversification strategy orchestrated by Mark Carney, executed quietly yet decisively, had permanently altered the economic landscape. Canada's exports, once overwhelmingly reliant on the U.S., were now spread across Europe, Asia, and emerging markets. Supply chains rerouted, partnerships forged, and energy flows redirected. Canada was constructing autonomy from a president who believed integration meant obedience. Here's the paradox: Trump's short-term aggression may have weakened American leverage permanently. The tariffs, doubling at mid-2025, fueled Canadian independence, forced U.S. industries to pay higher costs, and created uncertainty in sectors that had long taken predictability for granted. The auto industry in Detroit and southern Ontario, once seamlessly intertwined, faced fragmentation. Jobs lost in Oshawa, Windsor, and beyond were not just statistics, they were markers of a structural shift in North American industrial geography. The human cost underscores the gravity. Families who relied on integrated factories are paying the price, yet the structural recalibration ensures the economy will be less dependent on a single, volatile market. This is the cruel irony of Trump's strategy: by attempting domination, he accelerated Canadian resilience. The very policies designed to intimidate created opportunity, autonomy, and strategic independence. Now consider the geopolitical dimension. Canada's strengthened position sends a message to the world: even the closest allies are not immune to U.S. coercion, but neither are they powerless. Carney's global negotiations, agreements with Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the rapid expansion of trade partnerships have given Canada leverage beyond what it has enjoyed in decades. This isn't just economic diversification, it's a recalibration of influence, power, and the rules of engagement in North America. Here's the twist for investors, policymakers, and everyday citizens: the choices made in the Oval Office and in Ottawa today will define the next generation of North American integration. Path 1, the managed approach, could see a negotiated USMCA framework where tariffs are reduced, supply chains stabilized, and Canadian autonomy acknowledged without confrontation. Path 2, the spiral, could fracture integrated industries permanently, forcing the U.S. to face higher costs, disrupted supply chains, and diminished influence. Trump's role in this story is pivotal, yet it is the unintended consequences that dominate. His desire to assert unilateral power exposed the fragility of American assumptions. It revealed the limits of coercion in a world where integration does not equal obedience. And it highlighted the capacity of a calculated, strategic response, Carney's disciplined counterplay, to turn aggression into opportunity. The broader lesson is not political theater, it is structural. North America's largest bilateral trade relationship, the most productive in human history, has been redefined. Integration no longer guarantees compliance, interdependence can be weaponized, but only with mutual understanding. Canada, forced into strategic maturity by Trump's audacity, is now positioned to navigate a multipolar world with a level of independence it has not enjoyed since before World War II. And yet, the human and economic consequences remain stark. Workers in Windsor, Oshawa, and Detroit continue to feel the immediate effects. Industries dependent on integrated supply chains face uncertainty. Investors must recalibrate expectations. Consumers pay more at the checkout. Trump's gamble, while dramatic, has left real people in its wake. The story is not abstract, it is personal, immediate, and consequential. As we look ahead, one question dominates: which path will define North America? Will the U.S. recognize the limits of coercion and negotiate a sustainable, balanced partnership? Or will ego, unpredictability, and short-term political objectives push the continent towards structural fragmentation? The answer is not obvious, and history will not be forgiving to those who miscalculate. This is the reality Trump created: a moment of rupture, a test of sovereignty, a recalibration of power. Canada has adapted. The United States now faces a new strategic landscape, one where integration is no longer dominance, and audacity does not guarantee obedience. The choices made in the next months, the negotiations, the recalibration of trade policy, and the management of domestic industries will define the continent for decades. For the audience watching, the takeaway is simple: the story of Trump's tariffs is not just about headlines, personalities, or political theater. It is about structural transformation, power, and the unintended consequences of audacity. Canada's rise in resilience, autonomy, and global leverage is unfolding before our eyes. And the question remains: who will ultimately gain, the audacious disruptor in Washington, or the disciplined strategist quietly reshaping the rules of engagement?